With his shock of white blonde hair, his clenched fist and provocative snarl, he made a name for himself around the world.
Women swooned for him and men wanted to be like him.
He was never scared to sell himself using his looks and his body and that hint of him being this powerful sort of sexual animal.
Unconventional and uncompromising, he defied the critics and propelled himself to stardom. He was outrageous on and off stage, living the rock and roll lifestyle until it nearly killed him.
I remember arriving on the scene and you could tell that something was seriously wrong.
Billy Idol. In 1979, 24-year-old Billy Idol was the lead singer of Generation X. With his best friend, bass player Tony James, they had stormed the charts with a string of anthems for a lost generation.
Boy, they could really play, and they had some great tunes. They had a massive following.
Billy and Tony had played together for 3 years, but off stage, their friendship was beginning to fall apart. Billy had started mixing with a new crowd.
London was flooded with heroin. Billy got into it. And once he was into that, his relationship with Tony James, who didn't get into it, gradually became very estranged.
Billy and I were literally best friends. We roomed together on tour, we hung out together. And then girlfriends appear on the scene, and the girlfriends suddenly become an influence.
To make matters worse, the whole London scene was rapidly shifting.
Things had changed. It wasn't punk. It was new wave.
Despite their difficulties, Billy and Tony James still thought they could work as a team. They responded to new wave by writing Dancing with Myself. It was a different direction for the band, but it didn't get much airplay.
Billy said, look, it's all over. I need to go somewhere else if I'm going to take my career any further.
In an act of inspired desperation, Tony and Billy turned to a new manager called Bill Aucoin.
We wanted to have a new manager, and I said to the head of the record company, I'd quite like to meet Bill Aucoin. And I'd read this was a very TV-savvy, intelligent guy.
Bill Aucoin was the guy who managed Kiss. Billy and Tony James had seen that, hey, this guy had a vision. He realised that videos and television was the future.
There was only one problem with the plans for the band.
Bill Aucoin wanted us to move to America, and I didn't want to move to America.
When Chrysalis fired Generation X and offered Billy a solo deal, he knew it was time to move on.
He wanted to be a really huge star, you know, and America's where you go to do it.
Generation X was over. Billy was going it alone. He was launching himself into a whole new world that he barely understood. The American charts were still dominated by long-haired progressive rock.
The mainstream music industry didn't think there was a market for punks. Advertisers didn't want to touch punk rock with a barge pole. It looked really bad for him.
Still, Billy moved to New York in the March of 1981. The early months were difficult. The pop star glamour was gone. Billy was living in a tiny cockroach-infested flat in downtown Manhattan. He was on his own now, and far from sure he could pull it off. One night, Billy was at a club on the Upper West Side. No one was dancing. Then the DJ put on a new record, and everyone was on the dance floor. To his amazement, Billy realized they were dancing to Generation X's Dancing with Myself. The song had become an underground club hit. Maybe he had a chance after all. Billy could see that the music scene was rapidly changing, with television playing a far more important role in selling records. In August 1981, Music Television, or MTV, was launched. It played music videos 24 hours a day. To get noticed by MTV, Billy needed to release records aimed at the US market. He launched his new solo career with an all-out American sound, a cover of 60s classic, Mony Mony.
When Billy came out with Mony Mony, it was still the tail end of punk rock, which meant that the chances of getting airplay were very slim.
Billy's record label Chrysalis blamed his spiky hair and punk attire for this lack of airplay. They put pressure on him to change his style. Chrysalis wanted him to look more like teenage heartthrob David Cassidy.
He said, I am what I am, and this country's going to learn to love me.
Chrysalis sent out Billy's records without an accompanying picture. The radio stations were fooled and started to play his music. Then in August 1982, Billy had his first American hit with Hot in the City. It got to number 23 on the Billboard charts. He'd won his first victory with the American public. And this was just the beginning. 26-year-old Billy Idol had come a long way from the stuffy suburban lifestyle he'd grown up with. Billy Idol was born William Michael Albert Broad on the 30th of November, 1955.
When you look at Billy Idol's background, growing up in suburban London, there's nothing at all to suggest that he was ever going to become some sort of great rock star.
He comes from Bromley, or more specifically, he comes from a place called Bickley, which is the sort of posh end of Bromley.
His father was a sales manager for a big firm. He was appalled by Billy's kind of interest in rock and roll music.
I love music. I used to sing at home. I used to fiddle about trying to play a guitar.
When Billy wanted to buy a guitar and an amplifier as a kid, his dad lent him the money but insisted that he had to work to pay it back again.
To please his parents, Billy went to church and joined the Scouts. His father put tremendous pressure on him to do well at school and get a good job. But Billy's restless, creative mind couldn't buckle down to the demands of passing exams. One of his teachers described him as idle. It was something young William Broad would never forget.
When they were teenagers, of course, it was when the Beatles were happening, and the Stones and Jimi Hendrix, and they saw this great kind of revolution happening. And they were kind of led to believe that society was going to change to be this great kind of utopian place of free sex, drugs and rock and roll. By the time those guys got to their late teens, it was just clear that nothing had changed. In fact, a lot of the stuff had got worse. There were strikes, there was high inflation, there was rubbish piling up in the streets. Things had got really bad.
William Broad was frustrated and unhappy, but bowed to his parents' pressures to study hard and go to university. But within a year, music would turn his world upside down and put this conventional 19-year-old kid center stage with a brand new name and a brand new identity.
As soon as he dyed his hair to blonde and perfected the curling lip, he became quite a different person.
In 1975, 19-year-old William Broad was a student of philosophy and English at Sussex University. His life was about to be changed forever by the explosion of punk.
Punk tapped into this whole kind of mood in the country that people were just fed up. They were just fed up.
A lot of people think it's to do with violence, and to a certain extent it's not really. It's to do with like a musical revolution.
What's great about punk rock is its immediacy. It hits you right away. It just blasts you.
Billy Idol was kind of recruited to the punk movement by some friends of his who were fans of the Sex Pistols, and they were called the Bromley Contingent. People like Susie Sue and Steve Severin, who went on to form the Banshees. They phoned up Billy and they said, look, we found this brilliant band called the Sex Pistols. You've got to come and see them. They're gonna change the world.
The Sex Pistols arrived on the music scene in early 1976. They were outrageously offensive. Their gigs were continually shut down and their songs banned from the radio. Billy adored them.
Billy at that time was actually quite nerdy. He never really stood out. He never did anything kind of shocking. He was always a guy that was just in the background and would, at the end of the night, really give you a lift home.
All it took was a little encouragement from his friends and a bottle of peroxide to change Billy Broad into something new and different.
His look was very kind of understated. It was very kind of like 50s college boy. As soon as he dyed his hair to blonde and perfected the curling lip, then that dormant charisma became evident. He became quite a different person.
In 1976, inspired by the Sex Pistols, Billy dropped out of university to become a part of the exciting new punk rock scene. He put an ad in a music paper looking for a guitarist. 18-year-old Tony James responded.
I went over to his house in Bromley, which was quite a way across town for me, where he lived with his parents. And I turned up and I said, I was hoping you might need a bass guitarist as well. And we got together that afternoon and played around with a few tunes.
Billy and Tony joined a punk band called Chelsea, fronted by lead singer Gene October. Billy played guitar and Tony James played bass. In October 1976, they played at the ICA, but Billy and Tony were none too impressed by Gene's vocals.
I always felt Billy had something more, and I always felt Billy should be the singer, and already Billy and I were writing the songs.
After a couple of gigs, Billy and Tony decided to stage a mutiny.
And we get to the encore, and Billy and I say to the singer, we've got this new song called From the Heart. He went, but we haven't rehearsed that. And we went, yeah, we have, and we're going to do it without you. And we just went out and did the encore with Billy as the singer and left Gene October fuming in the dressing room.
That was the end of Chelsea for Billy and his new best friend, Tony James. They stole Chelsea's drummer, and with Billy as lead singer, they recruited another kid to take Billy's place on guitar. They plucked a name for their group from a book about youth gangs in Britain in the 1960s, called Generation X. Billy felt the need for a new name too.
All the punk rockers were changing their names. John Lydon was becoming Johnny Rotten, and John Mellor was becoming Joe Strummer. They weren't the sons and daughters of their parents. You know, they changed their names and they changed the way they looked by dyeing their hair and wearing outrageous clothes to kind of say, look, we're new, we don't hold your values, we don't want to be the kids that you expect us to be. We're not your children.
Billy remembered the school put down the teacher who'd called him idle. He decided to spit it back in his face and become Billy Idol. Billy Idol and Generation X played their first gig at London's Central College of Art and Design on the 12th of December 1976. 4 months later, the band got their first big break when they replaced The Clash at a gig at London's Roundhouse.
It was quite clear from the get-go that Billy was a rock star. I mean, he looked like a film star. He looks like a kind of English Elvis. He has that charisma, and you know you can't buy that.
Billy's powerful stage presence was spotted. In July 1977, they were offered a contract with Chrysalis Records. They released their first single, Your Generation, in September 1977. Billy and Tony James became a songwriting team. They spewed out an adrenaline-charged slew of instant punk classics. Recorded in just 7 days, their debut album came out in early 1978.
I wrote a lot of the lyrics, and Billy would write the tunes, and then we would sit, you know, in the bedroom with an acoustic guitar and put the tracks together, and it's really easy when it works.
It was the perfect kind of punk rock Lennon and McCartney match.
Despite the success, money was tight, but Billy tried desperately hard to live the rock star life.
They went out of this club, and Billy jumped into this car. They were driving over to this party, and Billy smashes the car. And then he gets out and he's almost crying, because it's not his car, it's his father's car. You know, he's like this great punk star, and he's actually having to go to his dad saying, "Dad, can I borrow your car?"
Over the years, from 1976 to their demise in 1979, Generation X built a strong, faithful following. But they never won over the critics.
Billy became a pin-up in teenage girls' magazines.
The teenage magazines were the first to report that Billy had started going out with Perry Lister. She was part of the emerging new wave music scene that was rapidly overshadowing punk. The freedom that punk had once allowed had become a straitjacket. Billy wanted out. In 1981, he set off for a new life on the other side of the Atlantic, with Perry by his side.
Billy Idol loved Elvis, and so he went to the country of Elvis. He took off for America.
Billy Idol launched himself into a music scene that wasn't ready for his raucous British punk style.
There was nothing like Billy Idol. Someone with short hair and what looked like an attitude wouldn't appear to have had much of a chance.
But the power of Billy's music broke through, and by the summer of 1982, he'd begun to make an impact on his new home.
He came from this environment, the UK punk rock scene, where sexuality wasn't much of an issue. It was an oddly sexless kind of community, and there was never really any sex in the songs.
In his new songs, Billy began to celebrate sex in a way he never had with Generation X. They loved it in America. But Billy was hurt to discover that back home in England, no one cared about this hot new Billy Idol. With sex center stage in his lyrics, Billy sought a new creative partner to help turn his erotic obsessions into driving, compelling music. So Billy's manager, Bill Aucoin, came to the rescue and introduced him to New York guitarist Steve Stevens.
Steve Stevens was an immediate follower of Eddie Van Halen, that kind of flash guitar stuff. He was perfect. He looked great. He was fantastic.
After breaking out with hits like Money Money and Hot in the City, Billy found inspiration for his next single from his memories of the world he grew up in. His younger sister had got pregnant as a teenager, and she and a boyfriend did the right thing and married. All his feelings about mindless conformity poured into this song. It was called White Wedding.
It was a great song, but it had a great video. The two went together and bam, huge hit.
In the video, Billy mocked the sexually repressed who made marriage as grim as a funeral. Billy's girlfriend, Perry Lister, appeared as the unlucky bride in the video. Her role caused quite a stir.
There's a scene in the video where Billy Idol slides a barbed ring onto actual Perry Lister's ring finger, and it cuts her finger because it's barbed as it goes on.
MTV cut the scene. It was considered far too edgy at the time. With White Wedding and many other videos to follow, Perry Lister played a major role in molding Billy's image.
White Wedding showed not only what great music he was capable of making, what great songs he was capable of writing.
For Billy, it was the beginning of a great love affair with the new channel.
The MTV happens to be your music TV channel, and I'll use it use it, the hell out of it, until it gets boring, and I won't bother then. I'll find something else.
In May 1982, Billy released his self-titled first album. It did badly to begin with, but picked up as the months went by, as Billy's singles made an impact on the charts. Billy thought the album would do even better if he went on tour. So with Steve Stevens, he pulled together the makings of a band. They found a drummer, a bass player, and a keyboards player. They started with gigs around New York and LA. Billy kept the setup and the lighting simple, so the focus was on the power of the music and the performance. Billy's snarling vocals and Steve Stevens' flashy lead guitar proved a winning combination.
Steve Stevens was extremely important to Billy. He was a great guitarist.
For his next single in 1983, Billy went back to his old Generation X hit, Dancing With Myself. The new recording tapped into the narcissism and self-obsession of the era and twisted it into a virtue. The song played in heavy rotation on MTV over the next 6 months, making Idol a household name.
He was the quintessential MTV artist. He was so camera perfect.
In the summer of 1983, over a year since the release of Billy Idol, Billy started to plan his next album. He found his title track at a New York party with the Rolling Stones.
Someone was passing around a bottle of whiskey that had a Confederate flag on the label, and Billy asked, "What's this?" And one of the Stones said, "It's Rebel Yell," and it set off a light bulb over his head. He's like, "That's how I'm gonna name my next album."
By 1984, 28-year-old Billy Idol was eager to get going on his second album, Rebel Yell. With his new record, Billy wanted to prove he could keep the hits coming and prove himself back home in Britain.
The title track has kind of become one of his signature songs, and it's the kind of song that everybody knows. You play it in a club now or in a stadium, and people are gonna, go ape to it.
Within 6 weeks of its release, the album went platinum, selling over 1 million copies. This success re-sparked interest in his first album, which within a matter of weeks went gold, selling over 500,000 copies. Later that year, Billy released Eyes Without a Face as a single.
Eyes Without a Face was a real departure for Billy because it was a much softer song. It was not as hard and kind of ferocious as his earlier songs were. He also kind of took it in a real different direction. It was a lot more seductive sounding, a lot less fiery.
For the video, Billy was determined to create something amazing, but he took things to dangerous extremes. He worked for 30 hours straight shooting the video under hot studio lights in a room full of special effects smoke. Exhausted, he collapsed and fell asleep on a lawn outside. A policeman thought he was a vagrant and woke him up. The officer immediately noticed there was something seriously wrong with Billy's eyes.
The heat from the lights in the studio was so intense that it almost melted his contact lenses onto his eyes and blinded him.
Billy was rushed to the hospital just in time to save his sight. Eyes Without a Face was Idol's first top 10 hit in the US. It was a hit in Britain too. Billy was jubilant. With this new sound, he went far beyond the London punk singer he once was, using his words and music to explore a rich, erotic fantasy life.
They weren't the immediate kind of fist-in-the-air punk rock type songs. They were more nuanced. There was like a real kind of emotional impetus to them.
With a third reissue of White Wedding and a follow-up single release of Rebel Yell, Billy became a superstar. In less than 3 years, he had gone from college gigs of around 600 people to filling stadiums. Billy was a charismatic and provocative live performer.
You know, Billy was really kind of pushing the boat out when it came to sort of his own sexuality. He was never scared to sell himself using his looks and his body and that kind of hint of, you know, him being sort of this sort of, you know, powerful sort of sexual animal.
Audiences went crazy for his sex appeal, and with phenomenal sales of Rebel Yell, Billy blazed his way towards becoming an American rock and roll icon. He finalized those gestures that became synonymous with Billy Idol: the pumping fist, the curled, sneering lip.
I think what's interesting about Billy Idol is that he attracted both sexes. Women swooned for him and men wanted to be like him.
In 1985, Billy built on this success with a greatest hits release called Vital Idol, and then a brand new album, Whiplash Smile, in 1986, backed up by a huge international tour. The album included the hits To Be a Lover and Don't Need a Gun.
Have a good day.
But at the very height of this popularity, things began to fall apart. First, things became strained between Billy and his musical partner, Steve Stevens. Steve had been there since the first album. He'd co-written 3 of Billy's greatest hits. His soaring guitar had brought electrifying energy to Billy's sound. He was a talent in his own right.
I mean, it said that Steve Stevens was kind of upstaging Billy. I mean, Billy was the star, you know, and all of a sudden he had this guy with him who it all attracted his own sort of cult following.
Steve Stevens was offered his own record contract and left to pursue a solo career. Billy was on his own again.
Billy bounced back after splitting with Steve by releasing a live version of Moni Moni.
It was a huge hit, and it was fabulous. It was such a great version of the old Tommy James hit, but it was just tremendous.
The video did well on MTV and topped the US charts in 1987. To celebrate the success, Billy bought himself a Harley Davidson, living up to his rebel image on and off stage. But his wild ways put an incredible strain on his long-term relationship with Perry Lister.
Perry had been extremely helpful to him in work. She had helped him with his look. She'd sung on his albums. She'd given him source material for his songs. She'd worked on his videos for him, appeared in them, choreographed them. Billy and Perry had struggled with their relationship throughout the 80s, mostly due to Billy's constant infidelity. And they were constantly in a state of reunion and trying to make their relationship work.
Things came to a head when Billy was busted in New York for possession of crack cocaine. He was arrested in the company of a model named Grace Hattersley. In a press conference, she claimed that she was Billy's girlfriend.
Perry Lister responded with her own press conference. So here's a guy that's trying to maybe have a woman on the side, and these 2 women are holding press conferences to discuss their relationship with Billy Idol.
The situation was complicated by the fact that Perry was pregnant. In early 1988, 32-year-old Billy Idol and his long-term partner Perry Lister moved to LA to escape from the crazy New York party scene. Perry was pregnant, and in June 1988, she gave birth to a son, Willem Wolf Broad.
Shortly after Perry Lister and Billy Idol had their child, they actually broke up.
Within weeks of the birth, Perry was listening to the baby monitor when she overheard Billy arranging a liaison with another woman. Perry flipped out and moved out. There was a brief reconciliation, but it didn't last. By the end of the 1980s, she had left him for good.
Billy managed to really mess it up this time. He had another kid at pretty much the same time with a 19-year-old. I don't imagine that Perry looked too fondly upon that.
With his personal life falling apart, Billy spun out of control.
He went off the rails. He went to visit Thailand, and just had an orgy of drink and drugs and smashing up hotel rooms, and having to be chucked out of Bangkok by the police.
As the hedonistic 80s ended, Billy faced the dilemma all rebel rockers face by growing old and out of fashion.
Rock and roll is attached